would bet that anyone watching or listening has probably not asked somebody before, could you teach me how to pray? I mean, we ask ourselves questions like, does this work? Or is anybody listening out there? Or I didn't quite get anything out of this. Hello? Is anybody out there? Like, these are things that we do while we pray, or we ask questions about prayer. But many of us haven't actually asked somebody or asked a question to somebody to teach me how to pray. Can you teach me how to pray? And maybe the reason that you ask these questions of like, does this work or how does it work? And maybe the reason is you didn't even think these things worked was because you never learned how to pray. You see, I grew up in a tradition where we had written prayers. And we had this gray book called a Psalter hymnal. I mean, that's a big name for a book, right? And it was gray, it had a cross on the side, and it had all the songs that we would sing on a Sunday morning with notes in case you wanted to harmonize and sight read, all the different verses in there. And at the back of that book was a number of different prayers that our church would pray together. You see, I grew up in a church, but I didn't really pray for myself. I grew up in a tradition where we would read what was in a book, but it was never anything personal to me. And even as I grew up throughout the years and my faith waned and I kind of distanced myself from the church, eventually I found myself back. And through a number of different experiences, began to re-engage in my faith. And it was during that time in my late teens that I remember sitting in a circle with a group of people. Now, we at Centerpoint Church call this a small group. It's a collection of different people who sit together and do life together and discuss the weekend messages or grow together, do book series. And I was in one of those groups and we were sitting together. And at the end, I'll never forget this, at the end, the leader said, now we're going to go around the circle and we're all going to pray. And I was like, oh my gosh, I do not want to pray. Somebody 2 seats over to me started. And as they went around the circle, my heartbeat increased and I began to become more tense. I did like the peeking prayer. Have you ever done this? When somebody's praying, you kind of look around to see what other people are doing. And at that moment, I didn't really know what to do. Even though I grew up in a church tradition, I kind of looked around. How are people praying or responding? I listened really closely to the prayers that other people were praying to maybe mimic them or try and figure out what they were doing because I just didn't know how to pray. And I remember it eventually got to me. And before it got to me, I didn't know how to pray out loud, but I did know how to say, God, at any moment, get me out of here. You can just get me out of here right now. If you can do anything, get me out of here. That was probably my internal prayer. Eventually it got to me. I got out a few different words. I think I ended with a yeah, God at the end. And then I looked over to the person beside me. And it was such a clunky end to the prayer that they looked at me like, are you done? And I was like, yeah, I'm done. And so we kind of made eye contact and they're like, did the little head shake, and then they continued on in prayer. And it was at that point that I was a little bit embarrassed that I didn't know. But I began by asking this question, well then how do I pray? And do we see anything in the Bible about prayer and how to pray? Well, we do. And so we're going to look today at a particular prayer as Jesus' own followers, the ones that are closest to him, the disciples, as they ask this question, how do we pray? Jesus responds. And he responds with a popular prayer. For some of you that maybe have grown up in the Americas or you grew up with popular media, you would know this prayer because it permeates our culture. And he prays this prayer. And this is what Jesus' response is to his disciples. He prays this. This then is how you should pray. And he says this, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And give us today our daily bread and forgive us our debts as we also forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. Now, before we begin to unpack portions of this prayer, there's something that needs to be said. These are the red letter words of Jesus. And he wants us to understand. And this is so important, so I need you to lean in. You see, here's what Jesus is teaching. He's teaching that prayer is about, a big word, surrender. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, this is what I mean. Is that you have a kingdom, and I have a kingdom. I mean, you have a will, and I have a will. And sometimes there's things happening in my kingdom that I want God to fix. Things in my kingdom that are in trouble that I'm like, God, can you come in here and fix these things? You see, my kingdom is at risk, and so I invite God to fix my kingdom. And Jesus wants to tackle this. This becomes the essence of, for many people, of why we go to God in prayer in the first place. We're in trouble. There's things happening in our life and we're like, oh no, things are shifting God. And what Jesus wants to do is settle something for his disciples, the ones who've asked him, how do I pray? He wants to settle for those that read, for those that listen, for you and for I today. He wants to settle something. That surrender and commitment is not to further our kingdom, but to further his. And in this reveals the purpose of prayer itself. And the purpose of prayer is to surrender our will, not to impose it on God. In other words, God, I'm not here to bend your will to mine, but here to bend to yours.